Okay, so hello all, welcome to our October SERC Talk, which is the second talk of the three-part cybersecurity series. For those joining for the first time, I'm Mimi Marcus, SERC admin, and I hope you find the discussion beneficial. We encourage your active participation. Some pointers on the participation tools. Please note that while you're muted, you can still use the chat feature for comments as well as the Q&A modules for questions. And then following the presentation, there will be a 5 to 10 minutes dedicated for Q&A, not addressed during the presentation. And if you so choose, I can unmute you so you can ask directly. For participants joining strictly through the phone connection only, please note that the slides are up on the SERC website for you to follow along with as the first news post. And you can email your questions and comments to me directly to include in the discussion. So I turn this over to Dr. Barry Bain, not only the SERC Chief Scientist, but our SERC Talk Editor-in-Chief, who will also be leading the discussion.
Well, welcome to the second of 3 SERC talks that we're having on cybersecurity. The previous one was by Barry Horowitz, and you can find it, as Mimi said, on our website. And the next one is Gary McGraw. The third one is going to be Bill Shirless at Carnegie Mellon University on the 1st of November. Is that right, Mimi?
Oh, sorry, Barry, I was on mute.
Yeah. So, again, to introduce Gary, he is the Vice President for Security Technology of Synopsys, which is a Silicon Valley company that's in Silicon Valley, Mountain View. And he's written 8 books on the topic of various aspects of cybersecurity. He's been the editor of the Addison Wesley Software Security Series, has over 100 scientific publications, has been a counselor for many large corporations that are trying to have stronger security than they found they had. And he also has a dual Ph.D. in cognitive science and computer science. And so, again, we're very fortunate to have him talk to us about, what are the top 10 software security flaws. So, Gary, it's on to you.
Thanks, Barry. It's great to be here. It's always interesting to give a presentation to my phone. Yeah. So hopefully everybody can follow along properly. I'm going to try to remember to tell you the slide number. So we'll move to slide number 3 right now. Today I want to talk about avoiding security flaws. And I want to contrast that with bugs. So in my view, there's a difference in 2 types of software defects, bugs and flaws, and today is going to be about flaws. And so I'll define my terms as we go on, but this is not a talk about finding bugs in code today. This is about finding flaws in design. Slide 4 emphasizes that this is work that I did collaboratively when we helped to found the IEEE Center for Secure Design, which is still going on to this day. There were a bunch of firms that helped us with that, including those shown on this slide, Google and Twitter and HP, EMC before they got bought by Dell, and Cigital before we got bought by Synopsys. So now we're part of Synopsys. I'll change that logo right there in real time. And this is work that we started in 2014 and we published in 2015. One of the interesting things about the particular results that I'm going to talk about today is it's the first publication that was ever put out by the IEEE under the Creative Commons. And that was quite a fun adventure in its own right, but I just thought it'd be fun to mention that fact. So I'm going to move on now to slide 4. The mission of the IEEE Center for Secure Design is to really think about software design in compromise and not really software implementation in compromise. And the idea is to look both at what problems are commonly found in software design, but also to try to solve some of those problems and give people the tools that are necessary to identify problems while system design is underway. And so the IEEE CSD first set of meetings resulted in the top 10 flaws work that I'll talk about today. And it's since carried on, and there are a bunch of other things that are available at that website at the bottom URL there from the Center for Secure Design, all for free, since the initial report, including a set of building codes. It's kind of a clever use that Carl Landwehr came up with. I'm sure a lot of you know Carl. Building codes for Internet of Things, for power systems, for medical devices, and also a security design analysis example with a fake product that we called WearFit. It's kind of like one of those fitness tracker things. The idea is that a lot of people don't pay attention to the design space in software security, and in fact, that's something that's becoming even more of a challenge now that CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development, other agile methodologies, and DevSecOps or SecDevOps or OpsI/SecSI/DevSis or whatever you want to call it, is now all in vogue. Because as we automate parts of software security, we're finding that it is pretty straightforward to automate bug finding because we've been doing static analysis for many years, but it's much harder to automate and speed up design review, like architecture risk analysis and threat analysis. The next slide, slide 6, tries to get to the bottom of this definition of two kinds of defects, one kind being bugs and the other kind being flaws. As I said earlier, I'm going to focus my remarks today on flaws. Bugs are pretty easy to understand. A bug in C, for example, is the getS system call, which will get data from standard in until the attacker decides to hit return, which means that unless you have infinite memory, it's going to be possible to cause some sort of overflow condition. So, you know, one might question, why is getS in C in the first place? And you might argue that that itself is a design flaw, but I'm not going to go there. What I'd rather say is, look, if you're looking through code and you find getS somewhere in your code, that's probably going to be a security problem. And so we can automate looking for silly system calls or known bugs or combinations of system calls. There are tens of thousands of things that are perfectly legitimately legal in a language that lead to security vulnerability. And so looking through software source code to find these bugs is something that we've been automating for quite some number of years. I started working on a DARPA-sponsored research project for static analysis aimed at C in, gosh, it must have been 1999, maybe 1998. So a long, long time ago. And we've made great progress in the commercial field with what Gartner's now calling SAS tools. That just means static analysis security tools. The biggest ones commercially available today are HPE's Fortify, although I think they just sold it to another company, and Coverity, which is a tool that my company, Synopsys, makes. It's funny because when I did my original research working on static analysis, my work ended up becoming the Fortify tool, and now I'm associated with a company that has created its biggest competitor, which is, I guess, how the world works, but that's been very interesting. So that's bugs, and we can automate bug finding, and we've made a lot of progress in automating bug finding. Of course, when you find the bugs, you have to fix them as well. So just finding them alone doesn't automatically, magically fix bugs, and that's an important thing to emphasize. But on the other side of this range, we have architectural flaws, like an attacker in the middle situation where somebody might be eavesdropping on a communication line or able to tamper with data going between one server and another server, or one server and another client out there somewhere, carrying out things like playback attacks and replay attacks and tampering attacks and all sorts of other things, injection of commands. And so this idea of a design problem that leads to an attacker in the middle is the sort of thing that I'm trying to emphasize today. Now, I've been talking about bugs and flaws being kind of 50-50 split for about 20 years. And in that time, we've made much more progress in static analysis than we have in architecture risk analysis and threat modeling. There is some very good work in threat modeling. I recommend Adam Shostak's book, and I recommend Chapter 5 of my own work, Software Security. But by and large, architecture analysis takes much more expertise than even finding and fixing bugs does. And we haven't made near as much progress on the automation of such things. One of the issues is that we had huge reams of data about bugs and about possible vulnerable conditions led to by bugs in code, especially in C and C++. But there are problems in Java as well, and even the new JavaScript languages that bind down dynamically to JavaScript like Node.js, those have some bugs too. But coming up with a list of bugs to look for automatically is work that we've made lots of progress on. So these static analysis tools have built-in knowledge regarding what to look for. And sometimes they even tell you what to do about it, but what to look for is the key thing. Flaws, on the other hand, have much less literature devoted to them. And so, though you might have heard of the OWASP top 10 bugs, or you might have heard of the SANS top 25 bugs, there was no equivalent in the flaw space for many years, and it was something that was difficult. I even asked my guys, the best guys at doing architecture risk analysis at Cigital at the time, now Synopsys guys, whether they could come up with a list of flaws. And every time they tried to take a run at it, we just found that it was really, really difficult. So I decided to convene a group of software architect level people from commercial and academic sources together and have a workshop on this flaws problem. And we convened a meeting up in the Northwest at Skamania Lodge. I'm sure some of you have been there. And the price of admission to this workshop was, well, you had to be invited, but the price of admission was you had to agree to bring along real flaws from your real engineering group. And so Google brought a pile of flaws, EMC did, we brought huge piles of flaws from all of our customers, the HP guys did the same thing, and Twitter, and so on. And so we had, without defining very, very clearly what a flaw is, a big pile of data about real flaws in real software. So the first order of business was to pile those up with bulldozers into piles and see if we had any matches among the flaws. And a little bit of work later, we found that we had at least 10 flaws that were commonly found among all of those disparate systems, among all the flaws that people brought with them to the meeting and dumped out on the floor. So, so we decided that we would first identify those flaws, but that instead of just talking about the flaws themselves, we wanted to talk about ways to avoid those flaws in the future. We had to remain somewhat generic, you know, at the whiteboard level, but that really is the most effective way of describing software design to this day. Without further ado, here on slide 7 is a list of the 10 flaws that we identified. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about these 10 flaws. Remember, these are not theoretical flaws that we came up with by just, exercising our brains. These are flaws that everybody brought with them, bound to particular systems, of course, and to participate in the meeting. And so this is real-world data that's driving this list of flaws. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'm going to go over them one at a time. So now on slide 8, we have our first high-level flaw, which is, and how to avoid it, earn or give, but never assume trust. And so I have a bumper sticker on my car that says assume nothing, and I think that pretty much sums it right on up. On the next slide, we're going to dive into that a little bit. There are some things that you can do that help make sure that you earn or give but don't assume trust, like making sure that all the data that come from an untrusted source out there are validated. This is tricky because there are untrusted sources all over the place that our systems sometimes count on, and sometimes they get really tripped up when those systems that we thought were trustworthy are not. For example, system time is something we often rely on, but it turns out that clocks can be wrong, and it also turns out that sometimes bad people can change the clocks on purpose. So when you take the data from a clock and you assume that it is correct, you might get yourself into trouble. One thing you can do when you're designing is think about the sources of all of your data and assume that those data are compromised. So we might want to scrub them, we might want to validate them, we might want to cryptographically protect them for integrity reasons. And those are all things that we can do when we're designing software that help us avoid this very common flaw. One of the things that we see as a problem is avoiding authorization or access control or policy enforcement, or using sensitive data in client code is a perfect example. I'll give you an example from long ago. We were working on a financial services system that was up and coming, and part of the design had this entire database of sensitive information coming down to the client code across the internet, and it was protected on its way to the client pretty well, but then the client, of course, unencrypted it and was trying to provide access control, the client software itself, from the user of the client, in memory. Now, the problem was that all of the sensitive information was on the client computer, and it was all decrypted, and access to that was supposed to be controlled by some control software, but the memory of the computer was right there, sitting there in the clear for a possible attacker. So trusting that the client would provide access control to these data that were sitting on the client was a really terrible design problem, and that led to a complete redesign, which was super expensive because these people had already implemented their system without thinking about that kind of attack. So that's what happens when you don't do the right thing with trust modeling in your design. The next flaw, number 2, that I want to talk about is using an authentication mechanism that can't be bypassed. So if we dive into that on slide 11, what we see is that we don't want users to change their identity without re-authentication. This is a common problem that happens a lot when people escalate their privilege. They'll authenticate as one user, and then they escalate and they get more privilege, and they, in some sense, change to root or administrator or something with more privilege without really properly re-authenticating. So preventing that in your design is super important. And there are many ways to authenticate users of systems. Some ways are stronger than others, and so you can dole out. You can consider the strength of the authentication before you do anything. For example, did we require biometrics, hopefully with the acceptance device near somebody with a gun? Or did we just require a password? Or did somebody just have to know that the server existed somewhere? You know, and so this notion of different strengths of authentication has been tied in modern designs to different sorts of authentication and authorization mechanisms. Of course, authorization is a different thing. We'll come to that here in a minute. But, you know, these systems allow users that have been weakly authenticated to do a few things, but if they want to do something more, they have to provide even more authentication, and that's becoming common. I know that Aetna has been working on that hard in their systems, and we've been helping them with the security analysis of when to escalate and what kind of authentication mechanisms make sense, and so on. And then the other thing is authentication should have a time period. It should not be for forever. So you should have some sort of way of timing out your authentication time period so it doesn't go on. Some common mistakes that we see are people trying to authenticate with shared resources that are commonly known, like IP numbers and MAC addresses. Those are terrible ways to authenticate people because you can programmatically change your IP number and your MAC address quite easily. And so what that means is it's not a very good piece of information to use as an authenticator. Another problem that's really, really common is predictable tokens like user equals 1 or user equals 2. If you put that in a URL, you bet that somebody's going to try user equal 42 just to see what happens. And so predictable tokens that are carried around for authentication purposes are quite a common design flaw that's very bad too. In fact, what we think is that you shouldn't stray past the big three, something you are, that is your body or your, you know, something that you have, like a token in your possession or maybe your cell phone, and something that you know, like a secret, like maybe a password. And those big three things combined together are the main ways of providing authentication in modern systems these days. So that's the second flaw. I want to move on to the third, which disentangles authorization from authentication. And I think it's very important that we think about the fact that those are not the same thing. And so even though we might have authenticated somebody well, we still got to worry about what they're authorized to do. If we dive into that on slide 13, what we see is authorization should be an explicit check separate from authentication. And reusing common infrastructure for conducting authorization checks throughout your code that's common is a smart thing to do, so that everybody's doing authorization the same way. They're not making arbitrary decisions. We see sometimes that, you know, people don't take context into their thinking when they're worrying about authorization, and so they'll give some privileges that are not very smart to dole out in a certain context. And so paying attention to context is super important. And then once again, just like in the authentication stage, we can't have authorization go on forever. And in fact, playback of authorization is something that you see all the time. So you get, somebody gets some sort of privilege and they have a way of freezing that privilege into a token, and they reuse it later. And that's a common failure in security design in software. Number 4 has to do with separating data and control. And by now in computer science, we've known that this is a good thing since, I don't know, the 40s sometime. And so if you have a computer where you're putting data and control together, that's not a very clever design, because sometimes it can lead control instructions, you know, it can lead to the case where they're coming from an untrusted source and they're still being run as control. So if we dive into this, we can talk about separating data and control by utilizing hardware capabilities. We have in many chipsets non-executable stacks now. We have all sorts of ways of marking sections of memory and stacks as non-executable, and hardware enforcement of some of those things. And those are good things to do to avoid this data and control mix problem. There are compiler flags that you can use when you're compiling, and linker flags too that can help you avoid this issue. And then, of course, it's best if we have structured types and we know what types of things are data and what data types are that are allowed, so we don't just allow, the sea of bits that is whatever underlies C, the programming language C's memory model, where you can have a bunch of bits that one day they mean a pointer and the next day they mean a 32-bit integer and the next day they mean a piece of code, and C can lead to quite a disaster. I think can't remember who called it the sea of bits the first time in front of me, but I love to think about it that way. Type systems are important. They've led to great strides forward in language design and security. If you think about Java and the good things about Java and type safety, those are a far cry from C and C++, where data structures are a disaster. Problems, of course, commingling data and control instructions in a single entity can lead to data that gets executed as an instruction, and some APIs just lead directly to this, and we end up with things like SQL injection in the database world, or cross-site scripting in the web world, or shell injection in the Unix world. And one of the triggers that you can look for in design of a language is this idea of eval. So you're taking some chunk of whatever and you're evaluating it, you're running it, and letting it control the computer. This gets tricky in languages like Scheme, which is a language that I absolutely love, where everything is first class and it could be data or it could be executed, and who knows what's going to happen until you do it, which is really fun until you're a security guy and it becomes not so fun. The next flaw I want to talk about is a really important flaw, and that is data validation. Super important. And if you don't explicitly validate all your data and you have data coming from untrusted sources, that can lead to no end of trouble. So data validation is an important aspect of design. Thinking about where data are coming from in a distributed system gets tricky fast. If we define a distributed system as one where somebody else's computer is doing part of the work, we got to determine whether we trust that person and that person's computer. So if we dig into that in slide 17, we talk about data validation and making sure that it happens all the time. That's number one. If you have a way of getting data into a system sideways that avoids the front door and avoids validation checking, that can lead to problems. Looking at the validation scheme is super important because people make mistakes in validation schemes even more than they make mistakes in password storage schemes, and both of those are just hugely common sets of flaws. One way to design properly is to have a centralized validation mechanism and really make sure that you define canonical data forms. So instead of storing stuff as generic as a bunch of bits or a string of bits or even a string, try to store them as actual types that have shapes and that you can validate, maybe with a type checking mechanism. So this, falls apart when people make assumptions about data and they assume that that data came from a trusted place. Sometimes even data that's cryptographically signed can still be untrusted. And so integrity versus confidentiality versus trustworthiness are all aspects of design that you have to disentangle in your mind. Just because, say, a piece of code is signed, that doesn't mean you should trust it. All you know about that code is it was signed by some key. So you can make decisions about trust based on that signature. And you can know that the code didn't change since whoever signed it, but you can't really trust it just because it's signed. That's one example. Another thing that we say all the time that's become pretty much hackneyed is it's really hard to compute a blacklist of all possible bad inputs. It's much better to make a list called a whitelist of good inputs and stick to that and say only input that passes our whitelist is allowed in, because the list of all possible bad things is an infinite list, and trying to define that programmatically turns out to be a bad sort of undertaking. So it's much better to say these are the sorts of input I'm going to expect, and I'm only going to take input that looks like that, and if it doesn't look like that, I'm going to reject it, and you build your whitelist that way. So that's your data validation thing, which is super important. Likewise, number 6 is really important too, and sadly, this turns out to be something that just people screw up more than anything else, because everybody thinks, wow, crypto is cool, surely I could make my own, and I'm just as smart as all those math dudes anyway, and so they end up rolling their own crypto. If we dig into this, we can say some very clear things like use standard algorithms, don't invent your own. Use standard libraries, don't invent your own. Centralize your crypto and reuse the same crypto so that you're not mixing and matching implementations. Design for agility, because you know what? We make progress in cryptographic analysis, and then some algorithms are no longer any good to use. If you're still using MD5 for your checksums, my goodness, you need to come up with a new way of doing that that's cryptographically secure. And get help from real experts. And I don't just mean mathematician experts, I mean applied cryptography experts. We've even seen cases out there in the world where world-famous cryptographers make mistakes in code implementations of their own algorithms that lead to security problems. And so implementation is just as important in terms of cryptography and applied cryptography as the math behind the cryptographic algorithm, right? So those are some positive things to do. I really, getting help from experts is number 1. And then there's some things that you shouldn't do, like don't roll your own, watch out for key management because you're going to screw that up. Really watch out for sources of randomness, which are very, very difficult. If you want really true randomness, you have to measure a physical property in the world, and it needs to be a physical property that can't be easily controlled by an attacker. So measuring heat off a chip can in some sense be controlled by an attacker who makes your computer work really hard and get hot. Packet, what order packets arrive in, and packet timing, and even the time of day, those are all things that are not very good sources of randomness. If you want to really do good randomness, maybe go out and look at the half-life of some radioactive material and measure radioactivity and use that to randomly to build a randomness pool, an entropy pool. We've made some good progress in entropy and randomness and understanding that over the years, but people use the wrong kind of randomness all the time to this day, and they make mistakes thinking that things that are random from a Monte Carlo perspective for, say, simulation are cryptographically random, which they are not. So pseudo-random number generators are predictable. And that's why they're pseudo. They're very useful for Monte Carlo simulations and other simulations, but they're terrible for crypto. And so getting this stuff right is really, really hard. And we all know this, but we still got to get to system architects and say, guys, really, you can't roll your own. Number 7, identify sensitive data and figure out how those things should be handled. Of course, this has, it's closely related to some of the other flaws that we've talked about at the top. If we dive into this on slide 21, we have some platitudes like know where your sensitive data actually are, how you're storing them, how they get computed in the first place, where they get put, how they get classified into categories, and then start considering controls on those data like access, file access, memory access, database protection. There are many ways to protect data, and a lot of computer security stuff has been designed around data protection. One thing that's super important is you should plan for change. You know, data do not stay the same, and data classifications don't stay the same. Although those of you in the government might think that everything just touches the, you know, it all leads to everything being classified, when there's a little bit of truth to that. But you should plan for things to have different levels of classification at different times, and maybe to have things that change according to context. So, you know, data sensitivity applies outside of national security realms too, and it's just as important for privacy. And what we've seen is that commercial companies are not so much interested in user privacy, and they need to do a better job with that. So that's where this goes, and PII laws like HIPAA apply here. So some things that go wrong: data sensitivity is context sensitive, as I mentioned before. Confidentiality is not data protection, so you have to be careful about integrity too. And when you store things and you use applied cryptography, you have to use that very, very carefully. And then trust boundaries are important too. Like, we might trust a piece of data here, we might trust because the system that we have doesn't really matter, or it's a public burner or whatever, but somewhere else a piece of data might be treated much more sensitively. And trust boundaries really matter when we consider something like a client server design, where the server is something that we have parked in our own server room, and we control access to that. And the clients are, you know, anybody's PC or anybody's mobile device out there in the world. We have a very clear trust boundary between what can be computed on what. And as we rush to compute things out there at the edge, and we even have stateless servers and stuff like that going on, we have to be super careful about those trust boundaries. This is where system design is really breaking down in the web world. Number 8, we're boogieing right through these things, is consider the user. Now, this should be pretty obvious for anybody who does design of anything, but I would argue that software designers are not very good at considering the user, and security feature designers are particularly bad at considering the user. So let's dive into that on slide 23. We can think about things like actually using a system and updating a system, deploying a system, configuring a system. Those are things we all have to consider while we're designing a system. We need to think about its lifetime. We need to think about startup and shutdown and end of life and all that stuff. And all of those deeply impact the way users interact with a system. Security is not a thing, and security features are not security. Security is a property of a system, just like reliability, and just like any other availability, any other software ility. Security is a itty, but it's still an ility. And so we need to make sure that we understand that the security property of a system is this emergent phenomenon, and that users have to be considered as part of that environment. We try to make things secure by default. It's better to have something be locked down and give that to the user, and then have the, you know, maybe provide some way to unlock aspects of it later, than it is to say, well, everything's wide open and we chmoded it all to 777 on a Unix box, so it runs as root and you can do anything, because there's no security there, and it's not secure by default. Many systems today, still to this day, ship in a situation where they're not secure out of the box, and you have to, quote unquote, secure them as you install them. That is bad design. It's much better if things come secure out of the box and we have to explicitly unlock aspects that might lead to security risk. Of course, there are cultural issues associated with users too, including whether they have any experience and what their cultural biases are, whether they think security is a big waste of time. And remember, most users don't care about security. If you think that your user actually cares, you might be making a mistake in your design. You should care for the user about security. And that includes not imposing too much security so that nobody can get anything done. You know, there's a joke that Spaff likes to tell that I like, saying that the most secure computer in the world is one that has its disk wiped and it's buried in a hole filled with concrete 10 feet down. That computer is really secure and it's also really useless. And so we have to make sure that we balance out security and actually getting stuff done. And then, you know, don't count on users to make the right security decisions. Users will screw that up. And in fact, in many cases, users just like to set their policy to whatever because they want to get their work done. So these are things you have to keep in mind when you're doing security design. Next to last one, number 9 on slide 24, is understanding how external components change your attack surface. If we dive into this one's really about the supply chain of software and the components in your whole system. Sadly, components in distributed software design are coming from all over the place these days. And so you might be counting on a module that was a piece of open source without even really knowing about it in your system. It's really important to explicitly understand that which components you're using, which ones you can trust, which ones you can't trust, and if you're using a component that is, say, a piece of public open source, keep an eye out for information about people hacking that, or problems, or new releases. Because if you're using somebody's code and a bug gets fixed, you have to change that in your software as well, usually. It doesn't just automatically get fixed in your stuff. A perfect example of that is the flaw that is now all the rage in the news about Equifax. You know, we got the guy from Equifax testifying in the Senate again today. Hilariously, there's a guy dressed like a Monopoly dude behind him photobombing. So I don't know if you've seen that picture, but it's pretty funny. In any case, because there was a known piece of broken open source in their system that did not get patched, Equifax is having an unbelievably bad day, bad month, maybe bad year. And unfortunately, those of us who have Equifax files, even if we didn't explicitly ask for those, they were created about us. So we have a situation where these people were gathering data about everybody, and they were selling those data, basically, but then they weren't protecting those data very carefully from possible attackers. And that's very bad. Of course, we all know from software design that composition is dangerous and that sometimes it leads to unpredictability. We know that security risks can be inherited from components that we use. We should know by now that open source is not secure, and anybody who says open source is secure by default is just a fool at this point. You know, it's no more secure than commercial software, and in fact, in my world, I think commercial software is in many cases more secure than open source because somebody got paid professionally to do an analysis and fix proprietary software. So these are all things that have to do with this notion of supply chain and other components out there in the world. Last one, number 10. Number 10 is about being flexible in your system. Often designs are just inflexible to change in both objects and actors, and they're very brittle. And so if you have to make a change, the whole thing just falls apart. It's like you pull out one of those little sticks and the whole thing comes tumbling down in a big mess of pickup sticks everywhere. If we dig into this one on slide 27, we can say things really clearly like, you need to design for change because change happens. This should sound familiar because we said this before with regard to crypto. Crypto changes, change happens. Be prepared to swap your crypto out in your design. Consider what happens when somebody finds a bug in your system and plan for security updates. This is a huge problem in Internet of Things design. that has no way of doing any system update. So you might have, you know, an operating system that's baked into a chip that cannot be updated, and there's a flaw or a bug that's found, and there's a way to attack that operating system, and all of a sudden, all of those IoT devices are points of compromise on your internal network. This is something we're still trying to grapple with actively. Code signing and code protection are good. Isolation and toggling are good. Be able to turn stuff off, whole sections of your system if you can, if a compromise is underway, or at least isolate the damage. And have a plan for what happens when, you know, you have a secret and it gets compromised. You know, how do you recover from that in your design? So, you know, stuff to watch out for is brittle security design that does not plan for change, code signing that's done wrong, that really, you know, puts too much trust in something just because it's signed without figuring out the trust model. Something that counts on keeping secrets, especially secrets that may be locally stored on an attacker's box. That's a really bad thing that happens all the time. And basic, you know, attacks on cryptography, where the cryptography breaks and there's no way to swap it out because your design, you know, is just like so deeply integrated into the design that really there's nothing you can do about that. Okay, so those are the top 10 flaws, and I want to give some credit to the other people that participated in this. I just crossed out Digital and put Synopsys on that slide. These are the people who came from these organizations to help with gathering up these flaws and writing the report. There's lots more information and much more detail in the document that I sort of gave a presentation about in the top 10 flaws. So you should definitely download that report and read it at your leisure. Now, one of the aspects about this report is that we had to remain pretty high level because we weren't talking about particular frameworks or particular engineering approaches. And in some sense, that can make the work a little bit less satisfying than you would want. And in fact, at Google and at Twitter, Neil, when he was at Twitter, and Christoph Kern at Google, went and made actual changes to frameworks in their engineering organizations based on this this work, and really made huge security progress at Google and also at Twitter. Twitter has a version of this report that has examples that are in their own frameworks, and that's pretty cool because it's a way of binding this work down to a particular situation. All right, last thing I want to do is give you some pointers, and then we'll open it up for questions. Here's where to learn more, some stuff about me. I have a podcast called Silver Bullet. We've got about 30,000 listeners per episode, and we just released an episode with Nicole Perlroth from the New York Times, who is one of the best computer security reporters on the planet. Nicole was the 12th woman that I have interviewed in a row. So I just did a year of exclusively interviewing women in Silver Bullet without saying anything about it till it just got done. And there are 12 just highly accomplished, incredibly good women who are interviewed in those 12 episodes. So I encourage you to go out and look at that stuff. All of those episodes can be found on my blog, where you can also find music and my writings and, you know, ancient stuff from back in the BitNet days. I've been on the net since '85, so just a while. There's this book that I wrote called Software Security. It's still a really good book. I think that it's best when it's kind of used in tandem with the BSIM measurement tool, which is a way of thinking about a software security initiative. We just released BSIM 8 last week. If you have not heard of the BSIM, make sure to download that too. It is available for free under the Creative Commons as well. So all the work I've been doing recently, I've been trying to publish widely so everybody can use it without being a corporation or paying money. The book you still have to pay for because Addison Wesley owns that, but I'm sure you could find a copy on BitTorrent if you looked. And then finally, here is a pointer to the document itself from the IEEE CSD. If you click on that link, it will take you directly to that document, which you can download and read, and there is my email address right there. And long ago, I sold a company to Twitter and accidentally became a Twitter addict, so I'm still on Twitter. That is my Twitter handle right there. Please follow me if you're a Twitter user. And with that, I will turn it over to Mimi or Barry, as the case may be. Would you like me to give you back control?
Sure. Let me.
Okay.
Actually, here I can take it over.
Okay.
Directly.
Great.
And Barry, sorry, I unmuted you, so you're available. It was just the feedback that I was trying to cut down.
I'm here.
All right. So hopefully that was interesting.
Yeah.
It was. Sorry, Gary. I know with the mute you couldn't hear our laughs at some of those. And thanks for the links. I'll be sure to add those to the main page on the SERC Talks page for everybody to access directly.
Great.
So, Gary, I think one thing that comes out of this is that, you can be very, very careful and produce something that is highly secure, but you're living in a world where everything around it is changing, and that a lot of the flaws are really not being careful enough about what you're going to do with the changes.
I think that's right, Barry, which is why I like to just say the pithy assume nothing. In fact, maybe you should assume everything's compromised and design that way. Of course, it makes it very hard to design a system when you can't trust anything.
Yeah, right.
but that's where we are these days.
Other questions?
Oh, sorry, I had myself muted. Jack, I'm going to unmute you, and feel free to ask your question directly.
Well, thank you. My question is simple, I think, and that is, how will this blockchain technology and implementation affect these ideas, these wonderful summary that you produced?
Well, that's a really good question, Jack. I do not know the answer to that. I haven't spent much time digging into blockchain, but really I believe that blockchain is not some sort of magic panacea that's going to solve all of our security problems. From what I understand, blockchain is very useful for clearing, for making sure that the system has done the right things in a transaction, and, you know, rectifying stuff with a history that is cryptographically protected. So maybe it'll be a useful feature in some aspects of design, but it's not going to solve all of the 10 problems that I just spent an hour talking about, just because it's magic blockchain. So, you know, watch out for the Pied Piper effect on this one is what I would say.
Thank you. It seems to me that although it's typically talked about in verifying accounting numbers, that underneath it may have something to be useful for verifying groups of code as to whether or not the code is, the various groups of code are copacetic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's probably true. So you could you could know chain of custody and you could know origin information using blockchain on code, but I haven't really thought about the implications of that. I mean, one of the things you got to remember is if you cryptographically sign and protect the integrity of a piece of code, that doesn't make sure all the bugs are out of it. So right. There are a lot of people that say, well, I cryptographically protected my code, so all is well, and you go, but yeah, you got a bug on line 42, so you just cryptographically protected your bug just as much as your software. And I think it's important to you know, bring that insight over to blockchain as well. But that's a really good question, Jack.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I think you might have done too good of a job being succinct.
It's always interesting to talk to a piece of plastic.
Oh, believe me, you had plenty of laughs on this side, but unfortunately the mute kind of shadows it for you.
The mute was good. I really appreciate that. I'm with you on doing that. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Barry. It's an honor to give a presentation for you.
Well, thanks for all your insights. I think this really should wake a lot of people up as far as all the various assumptions that you think are safe, but really have some pretty unsafe implications to them.
Yeah, and I think if anything, it emphasizes that we need to get to architects and designers, that we've spent a lot of time in software security talking to the coders and building tools for them, and not enough time talking to the designers and thinking about flaws.
And I think a lot of times we excuse the designers at the preliminary design review, and we really need to have them through the life cycle.
Yep, I agree with that too. Especially if you adapt, agile methodologies and you're refactoring every once in a while. Yeah. When you refactor, you got to reanalyze.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Just a reminder, we have the SERC annual events coming up on November 7th and 8th with registration open. We're getting close to our limit though, so please register now. And we also have our final talk in cybersecurity, the dilemmas of cybersecurity, why is everything broken, by Dr. Bill Charles from the Institute of Software Research at Carnegie Mellon. Please note that it is a different time slot than our usual. It's taking place on November 1st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And, oh, I apologize, because it looks like Jack also had a last-minute question. Just 1 second. And then, Jack, feel free to ask directly again if you'd like.
Oh, thank you. Just quickly, it was not a question, it was an observation. It says designers are, in fact, coders who are using a higher level, more vague language.
Exactly right, Jack. If we had a descriptive language that were formally specified, we could do some automated analysis on it, but it's really hard to formally specify what can come out of a whiteboard and a magic marker.
Right. Do you foresee SysML as being useful in that regard?
I know that people have tried to move that concept forward. I know Grady Booch and the guys at Rational really tried hard to build a whiteboard language, but I haven't seen one that really successfully captured software design, in my opinion, yet.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thanks very much, Jack.
Okay, I don't want to cut anyone else out, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask or forever hold your peace. Otherwise, we'll have the contact information, Gary, that you provided in your presentation available for follow-up.
Great. Sounds good, Mimi. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, thanks so much. Again,
okay.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. It was really a super experience listening to it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Barry.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.